The diplomatic summit at Station Meridian was supposed to be the crowning achievement of galactic cooperation. Delegates from 40 different species had gathered in the massive orbital station, floating peacefully above the purple clouds of Nexus Prime. The conference halls buzzed with translators working overtime, converting clicks, whistles, and telepathic pulses into something everyone could understand. It was all very civilized, very organized, very peaceful. Then Ambassador Krelnax showed up with his kid. Nobody expected the Vote ambassador to bring his offspring. The Vote were massive reptilian creatures, all scales and horns and enough bulk to make a rhino look small. But Krelnax had no choice. War had broken out on his homeworld 3 weeks earlier, and his mate had been killed in the first bombardment. The cub had nowhere else to go. So there he was, stepping off the diplomatic shuttle with this terrified juvenile clinging to his back, its crystalline spines rattling with every breath. The cub was only 3 cycles old, which in Vote terms meant it was still basically a baby. But this baby was the size of a small shuttle, with 6 powerful limbs ending in claws that could shred through steel, and a tail thick as a tree trunk. Its eyes, all 6 of them, darted around the docking bay with wild panic. Station security took one look at the creature and immediately started updating their incident reports. For the first few hours, things seemed manageable. The cub stayed close to its father, whimpering softly but not causing any real trouble. Krelnax assured everyone that his offspring would remain calm, that Vote young were naturally docile when frightened. He was wrong. By hour 6, the whimpering had turned into wailing. By hour 8, the wailing had become roars that echoed through every corridor of the station. By hour 10, the cub was having a full-blown meltdown. The creature's distress wasn't just loud. It was destructive. When a Vote cub panics, its spines vibrate at frequencies that can shatter reinforced glass. The observation deck started losing viewports one by one, explosive decompression alarms blaring as emergency shields slammed into place. The cub thrashed and clawed at anything nearby, not out of aggression but pure terror. It was looking for its mother, for familiar smells, for anything that felt like home. And finding nothing, it was tearing the station apart. The galactic community responded with everything they had. The Kilari, masters of sonic manipulation, arrived first. They were elegant beings, all flowing tentacles and bioluminescent patterns, and they'd calmed entire herds of stampeding creatures with their harmonic songs. They surrounded the cub and began their most powerful lullaby, notes so perfectly calibrated they could lull even the most agitated mind to sleep. The cub's roaring only got louder. It seemed to hate the sound, thrashing harder until the Kilari had to retreat before they got crushed. Next came the Zenthai, insectoid chemists who'd perfected pheromone-based communication over millions of years. They released clouds of calming scents, compounds designed to trigger relaxation responses in carbon-based life forms. The cub sneezed violently, then vomited a stream of acidic bile that melted through 2 deck plates. The Zenthai fled, their antennae drooping in defeat. The Lumina tried next. They were beings of pure crystalline energy, existing partially in dimensions humans couldn't even perceive. They could project thoughts directly into organic minds, bypassing language entirely. Surely they could soothe one frightened child. They gathered around the cub and pushed waves of calm into its consciousness. The cub's response was immediate and terrifying. It began smashing its head against the walls, trying to get the foreign thoughts out of its mind. 2 Lumina had to be carried away after the cub's panic created feedback loops that nearly shattered their matrices. Attempt after attempt failed. Sedative darts bounced off the cub's armored hide. Containment fields only made it more claustrophobic and violent. Every solution the galaxy's finest minds could devise only made things worse. The creature that had started as scared was now also angry, confused, and completely beyond reason. Deck after deck was evacuated as the cub carved a path of destruction through the station's central ring. Hull integrity warnings flashed red across every console. Station Commander Velvats, a 4-armed military veteran who'd seen combat across a dozen systems, stood in the command center watching his station fall apart. He'd faced pirates, mechanical failures, even a brief invasion by sentient gas clouds. None of it had prepared him for one scared baby. He gave the order he'd hoped never to give. Begin full evacuation protocols. They had maybe 12 hours before the cub's rampage breached something critical and the whole station had to be abandoned. That's when Jake Matthews looked up from his coffee in the cargo bay observation lounge. Jake was nobody special, at least by galactic standards. He was a cargo specialist for Terra Transit, one of the human shipping companies that had sprung up after Earth joined the galactic community. His job was simple. Make sure supplies got loaded correctly, check manifests, and occasionally sweet-talk customs officials when paperwork didn't quite match reality. He'd been on Station Meridian for a routine supply drop, killing time before his ship headed back to Earth. He'd been watching the chaos unfold on the public monitors, seeing species after species try and fail to calm the vote cub. And something about it bothered him. Not the failure itself, but the approach. Everyone was trying to do something to the creature. Force calm on it. Drug it. Manipulate its mind. Nobody was just being with it. Nobody was giving it what it actually needed. Jake set down his coffee and headed for the cargo hold. He had an idea. It was probably stupid. It would definitely get him yelled at by security. But he'd seen that look in the cub's eyes on the monitors. He'd seen it before, back on Earth, in the eyes of every scared animal he'd ever encountered. And he knew exactly what might help. Jake walked through the chaos of the evacuation with a flattened cardboard box under his arm. Station personnel rushed past him in the opposite direction, carrying equipment and personal belongings, their faces showing every shade of panic the galaxy had to offer. A Kilari bumped into him, its tentacles flailing as it hurried toward the escape pods. Nobody paid attention to the human going the wrong way. They were all too busy saving their own lives. The security checkpoint outside the containment section was unmanned. The guards had pulled back 3 corridors ago, establishing what they called a safe perimeter. Jake could hear the cub from here, its roars vibrating through the metal floors. The sound wasn't just loud. It was desperate, the kind of noise that came from a creature that had given up hope. He'd heard dogs make similar sounds at shelters back home, the ones that had been abandoned and didn't understand why. He punched in the override code he'd borrowed from a distracted security officer earlier. Borrowed was probably the wrong word. Stolen was more accurate. But he'd return it later if he survived. The massive blast doors groaned open, revealing the wreckage of what used to be Conference Hall 7. The room was enormous, designed to host gatherings of hundreds. Now it looked like a war zone. The vote cub had destroyed everything. Chairs meant for species of every size lay scattered like toys. The walls were gouged with claw marks deep enough to see the wiring underneath. Sparks rained from damaged light fixtures. And in the center of it all, the cub thrashed and wailed, its 6 eyes wild with terror and exhaustion. It had worn itself out but couldn't stop. Its body was locked in panic mode, every instinct screaming danger even though there was no threat. Jake stepped inside and the doors sealed behind him with a hiss that sounded way too final. The cub's head snapped toward him instantly. All 6 eyes focused on this new presence, this tiny creature that barely came up to its lowest shoulder. The cub's spines began to rattle, a warning sound. Its muscles bunched, ready to charge or flee or both. Jake didn't run. He didn't shout or wave his arms. He didn't try to look big or threatening. He just stood there, completely still, letting the cub see him. Look at him. Process that he existed. This was the first rule he'd learned working with scared animals back on Earth. Don't be the thing they're afraid of. Don't be a threat. Just be a presence, something neutral in their world of chaos. The cub took a tentative step forward, nostrils flaring as it tried to catch his scent. Jake could smell it too, a mix of something like cinnamon and ozone, with undertones of fear sweat. The creature was terrified and trying not to show it. Its tail lashed behind it, knocking over a chunk of broken wall. But it wasn't charging. That was good. That was progress. Jake slowly lowered himself to the floor. The movement was deliberate, careful, telegraphed so the cub could see he wasn't reaching for a weapon. He sat cross-legged on the debris-covered ground, the cardboard box resting in his lap. Then he did something that would have looked insane to anyone watching. He ignored the massive beast entirely and started working on the box. His hands moved with practiced ease, unfolding the flattened cardboard and creasing it along the old fold lines. The sound filled the ruined hall. A soft, rhythmic rustling. Nothing like the harsh noises the cub had been hearing for hours. No alarms, no panic, no voices shouting commands. Just the gentle whisper of cardboard being shaped. Jake had no idea if Vote could even hear in the same frequency range as humans, but the cub's head tilted slightly. Listening. He kept folding, pressing the seams together, creating a simple box shape. Nothing fancy. Just 4 walls and a bottom, one end left open. It was the kind of box that would have held spare parts or emergency supplies back on the cargo ship. Now it was about to become the strangest diplomatic tool in galactic history. The cub took another step closer. Its spines had stopped rattling. That desperate, frantic quality in its breathing had eased slightly. Jake still didn't look at it directly. Another lesson from Earth. Predators and frightened animals see direct eye contact as a challenge or a threat. So he kept his gaze on his work, just existing in the same space. Being calm because there was nothing to be afraid of. Projecting that energy without words or telepathy, just through his body language and the steady rhythm of his breathing. The box took shape. Jake set it down on the floor about 3 feet in front of him, the open end facing the cub. It wasn't big enough for the creature, not even close. The cub was massive. But size wasn't really the point. The point was the concept. Enclosed space. Boundaries. Security. Something small enough to feel like protection instead of exposure. The cub's massive head lowered, bringing those 6 eyes level with the box. It sniffed cautiously, a sound like a steam engine releasing pressure. Its tongue flicked out, tasting the air around this strange object. The cardboard probably smelled like earth, like the cargo bay, like something completely alien to everything the cub knew. But it also smelled like nothing threatening. Just plant fibers and glue and the faint trace of Jake's handling. What happened next would be analyzed by xenobiologists for years. The cub, this creature that had resisted every form of advanced technology and psychic manipulation the galaxy could deploy, reached one massive paw toward the cardboard box. Its claws, each one longer than Jake's forearm, touched the edges with surprising gentleness. Then it tried to push itself inside. Of course, it didn't fit. The box crumpled slightly under the weight of just its head and front shoulders. But the cub didn't care. It kept pushing, kept trying to get its whole body into this impossibly small space. Its breathing slowed. The desperate whining that had been a constant background noise finally, blessedly, stopped. The cub's eyes, which had been wide with panic for hours, started to close halfway. The universal sign of an animal beginning to relax. Jake reached out slowly and touched one of the massive paws extending from the crushed box. The scales were warm, almost hot, and rough under his fingers. The cub's eyes opened slightly, regarding him with something that wasn't quite trust yet but wasn't fear anymore either. It was curiosity. Assessment. The beginning of connection. In the command center, every monitor focused on Conference Hall 7 showed the same impossible scene. Commander Velvat stared at the screens with all 4 of his mouths hanging open. The station's chief science officer kept checking her instruments, convinced they were malfunctioning. Ambassador Krelnax, who had been preparing to euthanize his own offspring to save the station, collapsed against a wall with something that sounded like crying. The beast that had nearly destroyed an entire diplomatic station was lying in a crumpled cardboard box, being gently petted by a human cargo worker, finally, impossibly, at peace. The scientific community lost its collective mind within 48 hours. Ships began arriving at Station Meridian from every corner of the galaxy, packed with researchers, behaviorists, and academics who refused to believe what they'd seen on the recordings. A human, barely 200 years into space travel, had solved a problem that had stumped species with millions of years of evolutionary advancement. It was impossible. It was absurd. It had happened anyway, and now everyone wanted to know how. Jake found himself sitting in a conference room that had been hastily repaired after the Cubs' rampage, facing a panel of the galaxy's most distinguished minds. Dr. Yith, the Kilari behaviorist whose lullabies had failed so spectacularly, sat directly across from him. Her tentacles kept coiling and uncoiling with what Jake had learned was their equivalent of nervous fidgeting. Next to her was Professor Krell, no relation to the ambassador, a Zenthai whose compound eyes could process information faster than most computers. There were a dozen others, representing species Jake couldn't even pronounce the names of. They all had the same question. What did you do? Jake tried to explain about cardboard boxes. About how cats on Earth, perfect little killing machines with razor claws and hunting instincts honed over millions of years, absolutely lost their minds over empty boxes. How you could buy a cat the fanciest bed, the most expensive toys, the most comfortable furniture, and the cat would ignore all of it to sit in a cardboard box that used to hold laundry detergent. Scientists back home had studied it for years. Something about enclosed spaces triggered a comfort response in feline brains. It made them feel safe, hidden, in control of their environment. The assembled researchers looked at him like he was speaking a completely different language. Which, in a way, he was. Dr. Yitha's translator struggled with the concept of domestication on the scale Jake was describing. The Kilari had relationships with other species, sure, but they were partnerships between equals. Symbiotic arrangements. The idea that humans had taken wolves, literal apex predators, and turned them into pets that slept in their beds and wore sweaters was beyond her comprehension. Jake pulled up pictures on his datapad. Golden retrievers playing with children. Cats curled up on keyboards. A parrot sitting on someone's shoulder. A bearded dragon wearing a tiny hat. The researchers stared at the images in stunned silence. These were predators. creatures with teeth and claws and venom. And humans just kept them in their homes. Let their offspring play with them. Trusted them completely. Professor Krell's antennae twitched rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. His species had evolved as pure predators, highly efficient and completely solitary except for mating. The concept of cohabitation with other predator species didn't just seem strange to him. It seemed like a fundamental violation of natural order. He asked the question that was clearly bothering everyone. Why would humans do this? What evolutionary advantage could possibly come from befriending creatures that could kill them? Jake leaned back in his chair, trying to figure out how to explain 30,000 years of human history in a way that made sense. He started with wolves. How early humans realized that these pack hunters had social structures similar to their own. How both species benefited from cooperation. Wolves got reliable food sources and protection. Humans got better hunting success and early warning systems for danger. Over generations, the relationship deepened. The wolves became dogs. The partnership became friendship. But it wasn't just dogs. Humans had done this with dozens of species. Cats, because they killed rodents that ate grain stores. Horses, because they could carry heavy loads and move fast. Birds, because they were beautiful and their songs made people happy. Fish, just because people liked looking at them. Reptiles, for reasons that Jake honestly couldn't fully explain even as someone who'd owned a corn snake in college. Humans had this weird drive to connect with other species, to understand them, to make them part of their lives. Dr. Yith asked about the danger. Surely some humans must have been killed by these animals. Jake nodded. Of course they had. Dogs occasionally bit people. Cats scratched. Horses kicked. People got hurt all the time. Some people died. But humans did it anyway because the connection was worth the risk. Because understanding another mind, even an alien one, was fundamentally valuable to them. The researchers began pulling up data, cross-referencing Jake's explanations with human history. They discovered records of persistence hunting, a technique that was uniquely human. Most predators on Earth were faster and stronger than humans, but humans could run for hours. They would chase prey until the animal literally collapsed from exhaustion. It required understanding the prey's behavior, predicting its movements, reading its stress levels. Humans weren't just hunters. They were behavior analysts who'd been studying animal psychology since before they invented writing. Then there was the domestication timeline. Humans had been actively shaping animal behavior for longer than most galactic civilizations had existed. They'd created hundreds of dog breeds, each one specialized for different tasks. Herding dogs that could control the movement of other animals through pure behavioral manipulation. Hunting dogs that could track scents for miles. Guard dogs bred to be protective but discriminating. Service dogs trained to detect seizures before they happened or guide blind humans through crowded streets. The level of behavioral understanding required for all of this was staggering. A Lumina researcher, its crystalline body pulsing with confused colors, asked about the cardboard box specifically. Why did that work when their psychic projection failed? Jake thought about it for a moment. Then he explained the difference between forcing calm and creating space for calm. The Lumina had pushed feelings into the cub's mind, trying to override its panic. But you can't force someone to feel safe. Safety has to come from within. The cardboard box didn't make the cub calm. It gave the cub a tool to calm itself. An enclosed space where it could hide, where it could control its exposure to the overwhelming environment. The box said you don't have to face everything at once. You can make yourself small and protected until you're ready to be big again. It was the same principle therapists used with traumatized humans. You can't force healing. You can only create conditions where healing becomes possible. Jake explained what animal handlers called neutral space. When you approach a scared animal, you can't come in with expectations or demands. You can't project fear because they'll sense it and panic more. You can't project dominance because they'll see you as a threat. You have to exist in this middle ground, calm but not controlling, present but not pushy. You become a neutral element in their environment, something they can investigate or ignore as they choose. Most species didn't understand this because their instincts were too rigid. Predators always projected dominance. Prey always projected submission or fear. Humans could do both and neither, shifting as the situation required. The conference room fell quiet as the implications sank in. Humanity wasn't special because they were smarter or stronger or more advanced. They were special because they'd spent their entire evolutionary history learning to navigate the space between species, between minds, between fear and trust. They were the galaxy's first true generalists, capable of understanding and connecting with almost anything because they'd been doing exactly that since they lived in caves. Dr. Yitha's tentacles finally stopped fidgeting. She looked at Jake with new understanding. The Kilari were masters of their own kind, with social structures refined over millions of years. But they'd never had to understand something truly alien to them. They'd never needed to. Humans had been surrounded by alien minds since the beginning, every animal a different consciousness to decode. It made them uniquely suited for this strange new galaxy they joined. Professor Krell asked the question that was forming in everyone's mind. If humans could do this with one scad cub, what else could they do? How far did this ability extend? And perhaps more importantly, who else was wondering the same thing? The news spread through the galactic network faster than a supernova. Within a week, Jake's face was on every major information feed across 40 systems. The human who calmed the beast. The cargo worker who succeeded where the galaxy's experts failed. The story was too good, too strange, too perfectly impossible not to capture everyone's attention. And with attention came requests. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. The first official request came from the KRYNN Collective, a hive species that existed across 17 connected worlds. They had a juvenile in their primary hive structure that had somehow developed individual consciousness, a rare mutation that happened once every few generations. The young KRYNN was terrified of the hive mind, lashing out with psychic attacks that were causing feedback loops through the entire collective. Thousands of KRYNN were experiencing shared trauma. Their message to Earth was simple and desperate. Please help. We're hurting our own child and we don't know how to stop. The methane breathers of Titan 7 sent their request next. They'd just experienced a hatching event, something that only happened once every century. But the newborn swarm mind wasn't coalescing properly. Instead of forming into one unified consciousness, it was fragmenting into chaos, the individual components attacking each other and anything nearby. Their atmospheric processes were failing. Their colony was dying. They needed someone who understood frightened minds. Then came the arboreals, peaceful plant-based beings who'd never known violence in their million-year history. Their guardian beast, a creature they'd raised from seed to protect their groves, had reached adolescence and stopped recognizing its handlers. It was destroying the very forests it was meant to protect, and the arboreals couldn't bring themselves to harm it. They were watching their world burn and begging for alternatives. Request after request flooded Earth's diplomatic channels. Species that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence were now treating them as essential. The messages came from council members and colony administrators, from desperate parents and overwhelmed caretakers. Each one described a situation spiraling out of control. Each one asked for the impossible. Send us your humans. Teach us what they know. Help us understand what we're missing. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session in record time. Jake watched the proceedings from Earth, still trying to process how his life had turned upside down. The council chamber held representatives from 200 civilizations, and every single one of them was talking about humanity. About their strange gift. About their unexpected value to the galactic community. The vote was unanimous. Earth would establish an interspecies behavioral response team, fully funded by the council with resources that made Jake's head spin. Humans would be trained and deployed as specialized responders for any situation involving uncontrollable fauna across all member systems. They'd have diplomatic immunity, priority transport, and access to any resources they needed. In exchange, they'd share their knowledge, document their methods, and try to teach other species what seemed to come naturally to them. The offer came with a staggering sum of credits, enough to transform Earth's economy overnight. Technology sharing agreements. Trade routes. A permanent seat on the Galactic Council's Emergency Response Board. Humanity had spent 2 centuries as the newcomers, the primitives who'd only just figured out faster than light travel. Now they were being handed keys to the galaxy for the price of understanding scared animals. Jake became the face of the initiative whether he wanted to be or not. Earth's government asked, very politely but very firmly, if he'd be willing to train the first response teams. They needed someone who could explain not just what to do but how to think about it. Someone who'd actually done it under pressure. Someone the galaxy would trust because they'd seen him succeed. He found himself standing in front of a classroom on Lunar Station, looking at 50 humans who'd volunteered for the program. Former zookeepers and veterinary techs. Animal behaviorists and dog trainers. Wildlife rehabilitators and marine biologists. Even a few people who just really loved their pets and wanted to help. They were eager, excited, ready to go save the galaxy one scared creature at a time. Teaching them the practical stuff was easy. Jake showed them how to read body language across different species, how to create neutral space, when to approach and when to wait. He taught them about tools that worked. Cardboard boxes for creatures that needed enclosure. Soft fabrics for species that responded to texture. Simple toys for beings that needed distraction. Food as a trust-building exercise. The basics of patience and observation that any good animal handler knew by heart. The hard part was teaching aliens. The council had insisted that human teams include alien advisors, specialists from various species who could provide cultural context and biological knowledge. It made sense on paper. In practice, it was a disaster. Jake watched a vote try to approach a frightened creature and couldn't suppress dominance instincts bred into their species for millions of years. The vote couldn't help it. Every movement screamed apex predator, and the creature they were trying to help just panicked harder. The prey species were worse in different ways. The Helene, rabbit-like beings with incredible technology but rigid flight responses, literally couldn't stay in the same room as an agitated predator. Their bodies overrode their minds, pumping them full of fear hormones that made rational thought impossible. Jake watched one of them try to help with a juvenile hunter species and end up frozen against the wall, trembling so hard they couldn't operate their translator. The hive mind struggled with the entire concept. The chorus, a species that thought as one across billions of individuals, couldn't wrap their collective consciousness around treating a single creature as unique and separate. They kept trying to subsume the animals they were meant to help into their network, treating behavioral problems like software bugs to be patched. When that failed, they became genuinely confused. Why wouldn't the creature accept optimization? But the real problem, the one that kept Jake awake at night, started showing up in classified briefings. Intelligence reports from Earth's still developing spy network. Intercepted communications. Suspicious inquiries. Several governments weren't just interested in humanity's gift. They were actively trying to weaponize it. The Krell Dominion had started a research program specifically focused on replicating human behavioral manipulation for military purposes. If humans could calm aggressive creatures, could they also agitate peaceful ones? Could they turn docile herd animals into weapons? Could they override the pack loyalties of species bred for war? The implications made Jake's skin crawl. The Venn Confederacy was worse. Their intelligence service had stolen the complete security recordings from Station Meridian and were analyzing Jake's every movement, every gesture, every micro-expression. They were trying to create an artificial intelligence that could mimic human-animal handling, something they could deploy without needing to rely on actual humans. Something they could control completely. Even some Earth governments were getting nervous. What if humans became too valuable? What if the galaxy decided they couldn't risk humanity refusing to help? What if Earth's newfound importance made them targets instead of partners? The old fears of conquest and exploitation hadn't gone away. They just put on new masks. Jake stood in front of his graduating class, looking at their excited faces, and wondered what he'd helped create. They were good people with good intentions, heading out to help creatures in need. But they were also becoming the most sought-after commodities in the galaxy. Not for what they had, but for what they could do. For how they thought. For the space they could create between fear and trust. The first assignments came through. Teams deployed to a dozen worlds, carrying their cardboard boxes and squeaky toys and ridiculous Earth solutions. Jake watched them go and hoped the galaxy was ready for what humanity was about to show them. More than that, he hoped humanity was ready for what the galaxy might do with that knowledge. 6 months after the incident at Station Meridian, Jake stood in the observation deck of the Interspecies Behavioral Response Academy watching transport ships come and go like clockwork. The facility floated in orbit around Luna, Earth's moon visible as a blue and white marble in the distance. Home felt both incredibly close and impossibly far away. He'd become something he never wanted to be. Important. Necessary. Responsible for people heading into situations that could get them killed. The Academy had graduated 3 classes so far, 6 to 7 humans total, scattered across the galaxy like seeds in the wind. Each one carried the same basic kit. Cardboard boxes in various sizes, carefully folded and packed. Soft blankets that smelled like earth. Simple toys that squeaked or crinkled or rolled. Treats that probably wouldn't work on alien biochemistry, but sometimes the gesture mattered more than the food. And most importantly, they carried the training to read a situation and trust their instincts even when every expert in the room was telling them they were wrong. The results coming back were beyond anything Jake had imagined. The first success story arrived from the KRYNN Collective, sent through official diplomatic channels with about 40 different seals of authentication. The human handler they'd sent, a woman named Beth who used to rehabilitate injured hawks, had solved their juvenile consciousness problem in less than 3 days. The report was dense with technical terminology that Jake barely understood, but the core message was clear. Beth had recognized that the young KRYNN wasn't rejecting the hive mind out of aggression. It was overwhelmed by it. The KRYNN experienced reality as billions of simultaneous perspectives, a constant flow of information that mature members learned to process instinctively. But this juvenile was like a kid who'd been thrown into the deep end before learning to swim. Beth didn't try to force integration. Instead, she'd worked with the KRYNN to create what she called quiet spaces within the hive mind. Mental boxes, essentially, where the juvenile could retreat and process information at its own pace. The hive had never considered that solution because they'd never needed it before. From their perspective, the answer was always more connection, never less. But here's what made Jake sit up and really pay attention. Beth's close observation of the juvenile had revealed something the KRYNN had missed. The young one wasn't just overwhelmed. It was sick. There was a parasitic infection that was interfering with its neural development, something that would have spread to the entire hive if left untreated. Beth had noticed it because she'd spent hours just watching the juvenile, looking for patterns in its behavior. She'd seen it favoring one side, noticed the slight discoloration that KRYNN eyes couldn't detect, caught the irregular rhythm in its movements. The KRYNN's message included an addendum that their medical teams estimated Beth's observation had saved approximately 14 billion lives. The infection would have gone unnoticed until it was too late. But a human's weird insistence on checking if the bug was okay, as one KRYNN counselor put it with what Jake suspected was frustration and gratitude in equal measure, had caught what their advanced senses missed. Sometimes low-tech observation beat high-tech scanning. More reports rolled in with similar themes. A handler in the Demarch system had calmed what everyone thought was an aggressive void whale. Turned out the creature wasn't aggressive at all. It was trying to communicate that its migration route had been blocked by a new mining station, and the stress was causing it to thrash around in confusion. The handler, a guy named Chris who'd worked with marine mammals back on Earth, recognized the behavior because he'd seen dolphins do the same thing when boats blocked their hunting grounds. His intervention prevented the whale from collapsing a major trade route and probably saved the creature's life. On Velshora 3, a handler discovered that what the locals thought was territorial aggression in their guardian beasts was actually a mating display. The creatures weren't attacking each other. They were showing off, and the locals had been interrupting and stressing them out for decades. The solution was simple. Give them space during mating season. Problem solved. But it took a human to recognize the behavior because the Velocirons, being egg layers with completely different reproductive strategies, had no frame of reference. Pattern after pattern emerged from the field reports. Humans weren't just calming animals. They were seeing things that others missed. Making connections that specialized experts overlooked. Asking questions that seemed obvious in hindsight but revolutionary in the moment. Why is this creature doing that? What need isn't being met? What if the problem isn't the animal but the environment? Simple questions that cut through layers of assumption and cultural bias. Jake's personal terminal chimed with an incoming call. Ambassador Krelnax appeared on the screen, his reptilian features somehow managing to convey what looked like embarrassment. Behind him, Jake could see the interior of a Vote dwelling, all stone and heated surfaces designed for their cold-blooded physiology. And sprawled across what looked like an expensive ceremonial platform was Boxes, the cub that had started everything. Except Boxes wasn't exactly a cub anymore. 6 months of growth had added another ton to his frame and several feet to his length. His crystalline spines had darkened to a deep purple, a sign of approaching maturity. But he was still lying in a cardboard box. Well, technically he was lying on the shredded remains of about 20 cardboard boxes that had been duct-taped together into a sort of nest. His massive head rested on the edge, eyes half-closed in contentment. Krelnax explained, with the tone of someone who'd had this conversation many times and still didn't understand it, that his offspring refused to sleep anywhere else. The finest Vote sleeping chambers, heated to perfect specifications and aligned with magnetic fields for optimal rest, sat unused in the next room. Boxes wanted his box nest. The ambassador had tried removing them. Boxes had thrown a tantrum that damaged 3 walls. So now the cardboard stayed. But that wasn't why Krelnax was calling. He wanted Jake to know that Boxes had become something of a celebrity on the Vote homeworld. Videos of the cub's rescue had spread through their networks, and young Vote were asking questions their elders couldn't answer. Questions about fear and comfort and whether strength meant never needing help. The Vote were apex predators who prided themselves on self-reliance, and here was one of their young teaching them that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you're scared and accept comfort from an unlikely source. The ambassador's voice got quieter as he admitted something Jake suspected was difficult for him to say. His offspring had bonded more strongly with humans than with his own species. Boxes got excited when human ships docked at vote stations. He'd learned to recognize their scent and would actively seek them out. Krelnax had brought his son to a vote bonding ceremony, a sacred ritual meant to strengthen family ties, and Boxes had been miserable the whole time. But take him to the human quarter of the station and he'd settle down immediately, content just to be near them. It bothered Krelnax, Jake could tell. But the ambassador was dealing with it because his son was happy and healthy and thriving. That was what mattered. That was what any parent wanted, even if it meant accepting that your child found comfort in strange places with strange beings who thought cardboard was a suitable building material. Jake ended the call and turned back to the observation deck windows. More transport ships were arriving, bringing the next class of trainees. Former zoo workers and pet store employees. People who'd spent their lives working with animals for minimum wage, suddenly being told they were the most valuable specialists in the galaxy. People who'd chosen careers in animal care knowing they'd never be rich or famous, now being offered both. A message pinged through on the Academy's public channel. It was from Rachel Torres, one of the first graduates, currently stationed in the Outer Hebrides sector. She'd attached a photo that made Jake smile despite himself. It showed her sitting cross-legged on the ground of what looked like an alien savanna, surrounded by creatures that resembled six-legged buffalo covered in crystalline plates. One of them had its massive head resting in her lap while she scratched behind its auditory organs. Her expression was pure contentment, the look of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do. Her message was simple. Thank you for teaching us that the galaxy doesn't need us to be warriors or diplomats or scientists. It needs us to be exactly what we've always been. The weird species that looks at something dangerous and thinks maybe it just needs a friend in a cardboard box. Jake thought about Earth, spinning below in the darkness. About humanity's journey from caves to starships, always bringing their animals along for the ride. About how that strange compulsion to connect across species barriers had seemed like a quirk, a curiosity, something that made humans interesting but not particularly important. Now that quirk was their superpower, their unique contribution to a galaxy full of specialists who'd forgotten how to be generalists. The galaxy had faster ships, stronger weapons, more advanced technology. But they didn't have humanity's strange gift for looking at the space between fear and trust and knowing how to walk that path. They didn't have 30,000 years of practice reading minds that weren't their own. They didn't have cardboard boxes and the absolute certainty that sometimes the simplest solution works best. Jake watched another transport depart, carrying handlers to their assignments across the stars. Each one had been trained in the same basic principle that he'd figured out 6 months ago in a ruined conference hall. You can't force someone to feel safe. You can only create the conditions where safety becomes possible. Give them space. Give them time. Give them something as simple as a box to hide in until they are ready to face the world again. Humanity had found its place in the cosmos, not as conquerors or even explorers, but as the galaxy's unexpected caretakers. Armed with nothing but empathy, patience, and an absurd understanding of what makes creatures feel safe, they were changing the galaxy one scared animal at a time. And it all started with a cardboard box and a human who refused to believe that fear was unbeatable.